Okay, open your Bibles with me to the book of Esther. We're going to deal with the book of Esther today. It's not one of the most important books in the Bible. Some people wonder how it ever got in because it doesn't talk about God. It talks about God's people, though, and because it fits right here, historically, is the reason that it appears where it does in the Bible, of course. I mentioned that Esther and her story has a place. All of you who are Masons know about that, and all of you who are Eastern Star know about that. But it also is remembered in Judaism. There is a festival, not a big one like Passover, but an observance every year of what they call Purim, P-U-R-I-M. Because in the story there's a casting of lots, a pur, P-U-R, pur. And so from the word pur you get Purim. The main thing, I talked with Rabbi Sherman again recently about this. I said, now tell me again what Esther means to the Jewish community. And basically it represents to them what Jews have sometimes had to do just to survive in difficult circumstances, and that Esther and Mordecai become sort of role models for how one survives in a hostile environment. We haven't come to the great prophets yet this time through the Bible, but you recall that many of the prophets lived in the 8th century. They dealt with this period when the Assyrians decimated the 10 northern tribes, and some of them were trying to convince the northern tribes that they should reform. The others in that 8th century were trying to convince the southern tribes that if they didn't reform, the same fate would befall them as had just befallen the northern tribes in 722. There was reform, you recall, under King Josiah in 721, but it didn't last very long because the Egyptians came up and killed him, Josiah, at Megiddo. And almost 150 years later, another strong power, the Babylonians, came and destroyed them. There were prophets who lived during this period. Ezekiel and Jeremiah and the middle part of Isaiah. You recall the first 39 chapters of Isaiah fall here, but beginning with the 40th chapter, and that's the part sung by the tenor soloist to begin our Christmas portion of Messiah every year, "Comfort, comfort ye my people." That's a second writer. And so that Deutero, or second Isaiah, lived during the conquest. All right? So we have Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Deutero Isaiah in this period. And one of them is saying to the people who've been marched away and who are devastated, absolutely devastated, as they've left their homes, they have seen them being burned to the ground. Up on the hill, Solomon's magnificent temple in flames, the royal palace in flames. They see the Babylonians pushing down the walls, burning the gates off the hinges, and so on. We've been through that, but that was in their memory. And so those prophets, those three in particular, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and second Isaiah, had a hard time trying to get the people to hold up their heads. And it's one of those, Jeremiah, who says to those who've had to go away, plant crops, marry, have babies. They had no idea they would be released 50 years later. They didn't know. It spent 400 years in Egypt, could be 400 years in Babylon. Would they become assimilated into the culture as the northern tribes were, so that they ceased to exist as a separate people? Would Judaism vanish from the face of the earth? You know what happened right after World War II? Those who survived the Holocaust, they got married and started making babies. One of the speakers at the Holocaust service just maybe 4 years ago, I think, about 3 or 4 years ago, was pointing out how many Jewish babies were born in the first 3 years after the Holocaust. I mean, they were really afraid they might vanish from the face of the earth. And they needed to start over again, as difficult as that was. So those who survive, marry, make babies. Be sure that Judaism does not vanish from the planet. So that was the advice. Plant crops, get married, have babies, hang in there, be the people that you are. And the three primary ways: circumcise all the little boys when they were 8 days old, eat kosher, and observe Sabbath. Observe Sabbath. Of course, do the other commandments as well. All right. Esther comes into that period after the Persians have arisen as an even greater power. And remember, they are the precursors of today's modern day of Iran. And in Iran today, they do not speak Arabic. They speak the language of the Persian people. And they consider themselves not Arab, but Persian. So, many of the people did not come home, I told you. 1,000 years later, some of the most significant writings in Judaism to this day were produced in Babylon, so that it's called the Babylonian Talmud. And I told you that Rabbi Sherman told me just a couple of weeks ago, their best scholars think maybe only 10% of their people went home here, about 10%. So Esther and Mordecai were two of those who did not go home, who were trying to make a life for themselves in Persia. All right? All right. With that introduction, let me pray with you. God, we open this book of yours and ask your guidance and direction, the indwelling of your Holy Spirit, to help us understand, to find significance where we may, and to apply whatever we find that seems to be forever true to the living of our lives now. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. All right, chapter 1. We're going to skip around, but I'm going to read enough of it for you to get the story, if you've forgotten it. This happened in the days of, and look how many syllables there are in the king's name, Ahasuerus. The same Ahasuerus who ruled over 127 provinces from India to Ethiopia. Now I want you to notice one thing in this first sentence, and that's the very last word. You see beside it a little letter. You should. There should be a little letter and a footnote. And if you look down at the footnote, it says in Hebrew, it's Cush. You see that? Okay, the only reason I want to point that out to you is that we know that word. There was a river that flowed out of the land of Cush, where the Garden of Eden was. Remember? That's what Genesis says. Eden was where 4 great rivers came together. Tigris, Euphrates, the land of onyx and bdellium, India. So it's the Indus or the Ganges, and the river that flowed out of Cush. And Cush was Ethiopia, the Nile. Okay? So where those 4 great rivers, Tigris, Euphrates, Indus or Ganges, and the Nile came together, that was where Eden was. Well, of course, they don't come together, and they never did come together. But what the author has done there in Genesis is to circumscribe his world. Eden is where the Israelis lived. And these are their stories about how all things came to be up until Abraham and Sarah. So just point that out to you. Cush is mentioned way back there at the beginning of Genesis, and it's mentioned again here. Your translators have tried to tell you, we believe it's Ethiopia. Pretty sure they're talking about Ethiopia, but the Hebrew word is Cush. Okay. When we read the story of David also, remember when Absalom was killed out there on the plains of Gilead, and a runner was sent to tell the king, who was awaiting word. The runner was from Cush. You ever watch marathons? Who wins them? Ethiopians and Kenyans. Ethiopians and Kenyans. So, I mean, it is a part of their genetic code. They're tall and thin, and they run really well. Okay. Let's go on. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in the citadel, and you know citadel is usually palace and fortress combined. palace and fortress combined, is a citadel. And we know that, in fact, one of the principal cities in ancient Persia was Susa. Okay. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his officials and ministers. Skip down to verse 5. When these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in the citadel of Susa, both great and small, a banquet lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Skip to verse 7. Drinks were served in golden goblets, goblets of different kinds. The royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. Kings had to show everybody how wealthy they really were. Drinking was by flagons without restraint. So everybody's getting drunk as a skunk. That's the point. They're getting drunk as a skunk. They're drinking way too much. Huge flagons. Just keep drinking, and the king's servants keep pouring. For the king had given orders to all the officials of his palace to do as each one desired. Feed them and give them plenty to drink. Furthermore, Queen Vashti gave a banquet for the women in the palace of King Ahasuerus on the 7th day, when the king was merry with wine, meaning he was drunk too. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who attended him to bring Queen Vashti before the king, wearing the royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the officials her beauty, for she was fair to behold. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command conveyed by the eunuchs. She doesn't want to go into that drunken brawl down there that they've been drinking these flagons of wine for days and days and days, and now come and show everybody how beautiful you are. She refused. Well, at this the king was enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king consulted the sages who knew the laws. Now, stop and think. You and I live in such a different day that it's hard for us to put ourselves into that situation. But a little bit later in this very book, we'll read this morning, that at one point Mordecai wants his niece, Esther, to go and ask a favor of the king. And she says, if one appears before the king without being invited to appear, he just kills you. You just get put to death. You don't go see the king without the king inviting you to come. What did Samuel tell the tribes way back there? Kings take. That's what kings do. They take. So, the old boy is absolutely enraged. He's told the queen to come, and when she refuses, of course, now he's embarrassed in front of all these noblemen he's invited to the party. So, he asked his advisors who study the law on these things, they would be called scribes in Judaism, what is the law in these matters? I mean, what can I do and what can I not do is what he's asking them. Skip down to verse 15. He's told, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus conveyed by the eunuchs. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, he's one of these guys who knows the law, not only has Queen Vashti done wrong to the queen, but also to all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. I mean, she didn't just insult the king, she insulted everybody by not doing what queens were supposed to do, and that is whatever the king asked. That's his reading of the law. For this deed of the queen will be made known to all women. I mean, if your wife can do this to you, guess what our wives can do to us? That's what he's saying. Causing them to look with contempt on their husbands, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble ladies of Persia and Media, who have heard of the queen's behavior, will rebel against the king's officials, and there will be no end of contempt and wrath. If it pleases the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be altered, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and that the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, vast as it is, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. I mean, King, this is good for all of us. You can't let these women get too uppity around here. We've got to keep them in their place. This advice pleased the king. I mean, he was hoping to hear something like this. And the officials and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, declaring that every man should be master in his own house. Absolutely. Chapter 2. I mean, this is scriptural, right? Okay. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's servants who attended him said, King, there's a way to get over this. Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint commissioners in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in the citadel of Susa under custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. And by eunuch you understand any men that were going to be around the harem of wives and concubines was neutered so that he was not a threat. Tragic as that was, that's who the eunuchs were. If you don't want them fooling around with the women and you want them looking after the women, you neuter them so that they're no longer interested in women. Let their cosmetic treatments be given them, and let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. Well, this pleased the king, and he did so. Why not? Now there was a Jew in the citadel of Susa whose name was Mordecai. And it gives all of his lineage there. Skip down to verse 7. Mordecai had brought up Hadassah, and that word is her Hebrew name, Hadassah. Those of you who have been to Israel before, you remember anything named Hadassah? The hospital, yeah. The big hospital at Jerusalem is named Hadassah. And in there is a chapel, and it has 12 windows designed by Marc Chagall. 12 windows. And lots of women's auxiliaries in the United States of America raise money and send it to this hospital named for Esther. The Hebrew name, Hadassah. Okay, that is Esther. She was his cousin, for she had neither father nor mother. The girl was fair and beautiful, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai adopted her as his own daughter. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in the citadel of Susa in custody of Hegai, this eunuch, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. The girl pleased him and won his favor. How about the eunuch now? The eunuch likes her. She's a nice person. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetic treatments and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen maids from the king's palace, and advanced her, moved her up in line, and her maids to the best place in the harem. Esther did not reveal her people or kindred, didn't tell anybody she was a Jew, for Mordecai had charged her not to tell. Every day, Mordecai would walk around in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and how she fared. He's doing the best he can to be sure she's all right. The turn came for each girl to go into King Ahasuerus after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their cosmetic treatment. 6 months with oil of myrrh, 6 months with perfumes and cosmetics for women. 12 months they are groomed and then sent in one at a time to the king. When the girl went into the king, she was given whatever she asked for to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she went in the morning she came back to the second harem. She did not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. You got one night to convince the king you were the right one. Give it your best shot. When the turn came for Esther, skip down, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. So, this eunuch knows his favorite perfume of the king. He knows all these things. And he likes Esther, so he's coached her on what she needs to take and what she needs to leave behind. Now, Esther was admired by all who saw her. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus, verse 17, the king loved Esther more than all the other women. Of all the virgins, she won his favor and devotion, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet to all his officials and minister, Esther's banquet. Okay, skip down to verse 21. In those days, while Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold became angry and conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. But the matter came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, both the men were hanged on the gallows. And it was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Now that's important, that it was recorded, because the king will forget. He will forget, and then at a very crucial moment, they will look up the record and, he says, now who was that guy that, discovered the assassination plot and saved my life? Who was he? That was Mordecai the Jew, after things were getting really tough for Jews. So jot that down in your memory. Chapter 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman. We don't know him up to this point. And it tells you he's the son of a certain somebody, an Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and did obedience to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But, of course, observant Jews don't bow down to other human beings. Here comes the rub. But Mordecai did not bow down and do obeisance. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" When they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman. In the people along the main street there, Haman didn't seem to have noticed that one of the people there was not bowing down. So there are always those who want to be sure he knows there's somebody who's not bowing down. They told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would prevail, for he had told them he was a Jew. That is, he could not bow down and be an observant Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or do obeisance to him, Haman was infuriated, but he thought it beneath him to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So having been told who Mordecai's people were, those Jews, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So this is why Jews celebrate Purim, is that sometimes in very difficult circumstances, somebody has to stand up and do the right thing for Jews. That's what the story means to them. Skip to verse 8. Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered and separated among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws, Torah, of course, are different from those of every other people. They do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not appropriate for the king to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued for their destruction. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business." And believe me, 10,000 talents of silver was huge. It's like winning the lottery. "So that they may put it into the king's treasury." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman. Wow. He trusts him that much. Gives him that much power. The signet ring was used to stamp impressions into the wax on official documents. Haman speaks for the king. So, gave it to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. That's the reason this story is important. The king said to Haman, the money is given to you and the people as well, to do with them as it seems good to you. So what we're hearing here is Ahasuerus doesn't know Esther's a Jew, doesn't know Mordecai's a Jew. He's just told there are people scattered around throughout your empire, who didn't go home. They're dangerous. You need to get rid of them. And the king says, hey, if you say they're dangerous to me, they're dangerous to me. Here's the signet ring. Do with them whatever you want to. That's basically what's happening. Skip to the latter part of verse 12. This decree to get rid of all the Jews was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's ring by Haman. So letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces, giving orders to destroy, to kill, to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day. One day, from morning till night. Kill them all. Okay, skip down to the latter part of verse 15. The king and Haman sat down to drink. Haman's convinced the king this is a good thing. These are really bad people. You don't want anything to do with them. Just rid them from your whole province. Okay, that's what they're doing. And so now the decrees have gone out. That 24-hour period is coming. They sit down and have a big drink. But the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Why? Because there are Jews who've established themselves. Even if people don't know that Esther is one of them, Mordecai is one of them, the Jews are a people who know how to do business. They know how to survive, and God gives guidance and direction. They are important people to the functioning of the city. So when this decree goes out, kill them all. You got 24 hours, kill them all. You can see confusion reigned. Chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, what was going on between the king and Haman, tore his clothes, undone, he's grieving, put on sackcloth, ashes on the head, he feels lower than dirt. And when they say ashes, of course, they don't mean hot. It's not burning ash. It just means from the fire. From dust you came, to dust and ashes you shall return. You're completely undone. That's the point. Not that he's torturing, burning himself. Just lower than dirt. And he went through the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. Skip down to the latter part of verse 3. There was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. As the word spreads, they're going to kill us all in one 24-hour period. You can imagine how the Jews felt. Now, when Esther's maids came and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai. She's telling her uncle, gussy yourself up here. We got to do something, but this isn't accomplishing anything. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, and so on, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why. Why is her uncle behaving the way he is? Look at verse 7. Mordecai told him, this eunuch she had sent, all that had happened. Skip to verse 8. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king to make supplication to him and entreat him for her people. Esther maybe can turn the tide. Nobody has the king's ear in the bedroom but Esther. Okay. Verse 10, then Esther spoke to Hathach, this eunuch, and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know, here comes what I was telling you, that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, all alike are to be put to death. You do not walk into the king's presence without being invited. Only if the king holds out the golden scepter to someone, may that person live. I myself have not been called to come into the king for 30 days. I haven't seen him in a month." When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews." Okay, this is the key to the whole book of Esther, right here. Esther, if they get all the rest of us, they will get you too. And the Jews learned that in the Holocaust. Some of them actually went down the street and had their children baptized in Christian churches. Changed their names to Christian names in whichever country they were in. And Hitler went back 3 generations. Didn't settle with the name now, whether one's been baptized now. If you were a Jew 3 generations ago, you're a Jew now. Burn them. Didn't save them. So this is very important. You can see that the Jews who survived the Holocaust and those who live after it would find this book very meaningful to them. Esther, if you save yourself and all the rest of us die, you're going to die too. He will get you too. Word will get to him. You are one of them. One of us. Okay? But here comes another key line. Follow me along here. If you keep silence at such a time as this is the key word, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter. That is, they were believing that if Esther failed them, God would not let all the Jews die. He would preserve them somehow. But you and your father's family will perish. Here comes the line that every Jew is supposed to hear. And of course we Christians could hear it too. Who knows? Perhaps you have come for just such a time as this. Don't depend on somebody else. Don't count on somebody else. If you can do something for your people, then you are the one God expects to do something for your people. Okay? Can't count on somebody else. Will you stand up, Esther? It's your turn. Who knows? Perhaps you have come for just such a time as this. And I left out 3 little words you can see there, to royal dignity. But the point is, you've been put in this place so that you could make a difference. Now, will you do that or will you not? Well, Esther got the message. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, they're using a messenger back and forth, one of these eunuchs, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him. Now, even though God is not mentioned specifically here, Jews fasted because they believed God had commanded them to. You understand? So when people say, well, this scroll shouldn't have gotten in because it doesn't specifically say God, it's apparent, that this is what's being intended. That these are observant Jews. Mordecai would have bowed down to Haman if he were not an observant Jew who knew he wasn't supposed to do that. And Esther would not be fasting and praying and asking Mordecai and every other Jew in Susa to fast and pray, hoping, praying that when she walks into the king's chamber without being invited, he will not kill her or have her killed. Okay, that's what that's all about, even though God specifically is not mentioned. Okay, so 3 days and nights. Fast, pray. Now, chapter 5. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, opposite the king's hall. Those of you who've been in the big palaces in Europe, and you've had guided tours, they will tell you that if you had a certain grievance or invitation, you could come this far and no farther, unless you were invited. Then you got to come into this room, and you could plead your case or whatever. And they might tell you, go away, and you went. No, you got to come into the next chamber. And the king was, 5 or 6 chambers away. And only if you were heard and this person thought, well, yeah, he or she has something that needs to be addressed, move on to the next room, the next room, the next room. So she's standing in the inner chamber, but not in the presence of the king just yet. She's getting closer, as it were. The king was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace, opposite the entrance to the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor. He held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the top of this scepter. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to half of my kingdom." Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today for a banquet that I've prepared for the king." The king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther desires." Haman does not know that Esther and Mordecai are related, and he doesn't know Esther is a Jew. So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. While they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." But Esther said, "This is my petition and request. If I have won the king's favor, if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and then I will do as the king has said." So she's winning the king one event after the other. I'm not ready to tell you yet. How about coming to another dinner tomorrow? Okay, wow, that'll be wonderful. So Haman went out that day happy and in good spirits. Doesn't have a clue. Esther and Mordecai are related. She's a Jew. But when Haman saw Mordecai, he now knows what he is in the king's gate, and observed that he neither rose nor trembled before him. He was infuriated with Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. I mean, on the day that's coming, they're all going to get killed, and that'll include Mordecai. That's what Haman believes. Skip down to verse 14. Then his wife, Haman's wife Zeresh, and all her friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made." Remember how tall a cubit is? Tip of the elbow, tip of the longest finger, about 18 inches. 50 cubits high, a 75-foot high gallows. This is not just being made to kill somebody, but to show everybody, like crucifixion was. Show everybody. You better bow down when the time comes, or you can end up on this huge gallows. "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made. In the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the banquet in good spirits." I mean, he's excited. You ever been invited to eat with somebody important, and you get to go and eat with them, and they say, "Well, let's do this again tomorrow." "Oh, wonderful." Go with the king to the banquet in good spirits. This advice pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Some of you knew and loved Bishop Galloway like we did. I had a district superintendent in Beaumont when Bishop Galloway came out of retirement to lead our conference for the remainder of a quadrennium when our bishop died very suddenly of a heart attack, Kenneth Copeland. And Kenneth Copeland was a bishop that liked to do things with flair. If you got invited to come eat lunch with Bishop Copeland in Houston, you went up to the Petroleum Club. And it was a very prominent club in Houston. Some of the most powerful oil men and women belonged to the Petroleum Club, and that's where Kenneth Copeland had you go to lunch if he had summoned you to come to lunch. So my district superintendent told me, "Bishop Galloway, the new bishop, has invited me to come over and have lunch with him and talk about the preachers and churches in my district." And he was beside himself. I said, "Well, you have to tell me all about it when you get back." I was pastoring Trinity Church, his biggest church in his district at that time. So the next day, I called him. I said, "Hey, how was lunch with Bishop Galloway?" He said he's very businesslike. I said, "Really? What happened?" He said, "Well, I was supposed to get there at 11 o'clock. And so I was ushered into his office, and he immediately said, "James, I have the list of all the churches in your district. I want you to tell me a little bit about each one of them. Tell me." So he said, "I'm going down the list, and I'm telling him, and who pastors that, and what is he or she like, and so on." And he said, we had gone over that about an hour, and he said, "Hey, it's about lunchtime, James. You hungry?" And I said, "Yes, sir, Bishop, I am." He said, "Okay." And he said, he had a little refrigerator about this tall in the corner of his office. And he opened it up, and he had a couple of cans of Vienna sausage and a piece of cheddar cheese and a package of Nabisco crackers. And he went in his little bathroom and he ran the hot water and stuck those little cans of Vienna sausage under that hot water to melt that gelatin stuff. And he pulled the top off and handed me a can and handed me a hunk of cheese and a few crackers, and we kept working. So, anyway, Haman's expecting big things. He's been invited to eat with two people, the king and queen, and now he's been invited to go back again. And everything's going wonderfully well for him, except for that guy Mordecai that won't bow down to him. Chapter 6. Well, that night the king could not sleep. Now here again, you see, is an insight to Jews that God's working on him. Even though the king would not have acknowledged Israel's God, something's going on. The old king cannot sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of records, and they were read to the king. It was found written how Mordecai had told about those two eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. The king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. So the king's servants told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" And Haman thinks that means him. He is the one the king is about to honor. Haman said to him, "Whom would the king wish to honor?" "More than me," he's saying to himself. So Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king wishes to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king himself has worn, and a horse that the king himself has ridden, with a royal crown on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him." You have to shout this out as you go through the crowd. "Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor." So the king said to Haman, because he didn't know about all this stuff that prompted the edict, he didn't know that Mordecai wouldn't bow down to Haman and that Mordecai is a Jew, and that prompted the whole thing about killing all the Jews. So the king said to Haman, "Quickly, take the robes that he has worn, the king himself, and the horse which he had ridden himself, as you have said, and do so," and here he does say, "to the Jew Mordecai who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse and robed Mordecai and led him riding through the open square of the city, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house mourning and with his head covered. He's crushed. So he tells his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisors and his wife said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom your downfall has begun, is of the Jewish people, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him. You see how Jews would love that sentence. Wow. Even Haman's wife recognizes you just can't finally defeat and destroy God's people. If you've picked a fight with a Jew, you're in real trouble. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman off to the banquet. There's no indication that he knows yet that Esther is the niece of Mordecai. She's the queen, the king's wife. And she's prepared dinner, and he's all set to go. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. What is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition, and the lives of my people. That is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace. But no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he who has presumed to do this?" Amazing how kings forget, isn't it? Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. He knows that kings, they just operate on a whim. And if he's smelling Esther with this wonderful perfume that she wears and so on, he knows he's in a peck of trouble. Old Haman. They can turn so quickly from honoring Haman and giving him his own signet ring to make this happen. He knows that if the king turns on a dime, he's dead. So the king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. And notice, this is almost like Keystone Cops. Esther seems to be, stretched out at the table. They didn't have chairs and tables usually. They reclined at table. And so she's on the pillows there at the table. And Haman is now begging for his life. And he's scurried across over to where she is. And the king's gone out in the garden. Oh, my goodness. My right-hand man is the one that needs to be killed. And he comes back in and thinks Haman is trying to put the make on his queen here on the pillows. Notice, but Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king had determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. And then the king's anger abated. He felt better about everything. Chapter 8. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her uncle. Then the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. So Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and pleading with him to avert the evil design of Haman and the plot he had devised against the Jews. She and Mordecai are okay, but what about all those others who are about to be killed in one 24-hour swoop? So the king held out the golden scepter to Esther. Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, If it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman. Skip to verse 6. How can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to the Jew Mordecai, See, I have given Esther the house of Haman. They have hanged him on the gallows because he plotted to lay hands on the Jews. You may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. Skip to verse 15. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king, wearing royal robes of blue and white. What are the colors in modern-day Israel? Blue and white. The flag of Israel, blue and white. With a great golden crown and a mantle of fine linen and purple, while the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness, joy and honor. In every province, in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict came, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a festival and a holiday. Purim. Okay, skip to verse 13. Esther said, If it pleases the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. I mean, we not only want Haman gone, we want all of his progeny to be gone as well. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. I mean, David got Goliath on the ground, and then he ran over and cut off his head. Elijah defeated the 400 prophets of Baal, and he had them line up, and he put his foot on their neck and cut off their heads. It was a tough world to live in back there. Okay, skip to verse 19, because this will help you understand Jewish neighbors. Therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the open towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar, that's the lunar calendar, as a day for gladness and feasting, a holiday on which they send gifts of food to one another. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar and also the 15th day of the same month, that is, the 2 days, year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor. So the Jews adopted as a custom what they had begun to do, as Mordecai had written to them. Haman, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, P-U-R, that is, the lot, to crush and destroy them. Verse 26, Therefore these days are called Purim, from the word poor. That's all we need to read, I think. Any questions about Esther? Anything about that book? Okay, turn to Job. We have just a moment, but I want you to turn with me. I can assure you we are not going to do all of the book of Job. We've done that twice, and we aren't going to do all of it. I will really try to do just the highlights, but it is an important book. Let me remind you that a few years ago, every nine years, one of those years, Job comes up for preaching. And I had called Rabbi Sherman some years ago when it came up in that next year. And I asked him, what are the best commentaries you have on Job? And he said, I don't preach on Job. I said, why not? He said, I've never felt I was old enough and wise enough to preach on Job. I said, you're as old as I am. He said, I rest my case. I said, well, if I'm a lectionary preacher, I told my people I would preach all the most significant passages in the Bible once every 9 years, and then we'd start over. So Job's coming up. I have to preach whether I'm wise enough or not. And I do have some good commentaries on Job, but I can assure you that authors, even very good ones, who've spent 40 years dealing with that one book, and there are such scholars who've spent 40 years on that one book, still struggle with it. It was written at a time when the prevailing attitude was, if you live a long time and you make a lot of money and you're surrounded with children and grandchildren, you must have been a good person. And if you died young and sick and poor, you must have been a bad person. That was the prevailing thought. And somebody decided that's not right. I know some really good people who've had really horrible things happen to them. And the book of Job got written. It's a debate, as you recall. It's a debate. After all the calamities that befall Job, friends come. Sometimes when you're in the hospital, I know, and I walk in and there's a room full of people and I can tell you're not too sick. I sometimes say, I hope these are not like the comforters of Job. Because if you recall, Job's best friend, supposedly, when nobody else was around, kept saying, come on, Job, fess up. What'd you do wrong? Fess up. What'd you do wrong? Because they just cannot believe that all the terrible things that happened to Job would happen to a good man. And yet, right at the beginning of the book, God says, Job's the best I got. I don't have anybody better than Job. So the primary point of the book, and we'll go into some more detail, but we won't read nearly all. The primary point of the book is really bad things sometimes happen to really good people. And sometimes really bad people seem to escape a lot of really bad things. Really bad people sometimes seem to prosper. And really good people sometimes have really bad things happen to them. Sickness, death, failure of business, whatever. Even for really good people. Really good people. And that you cannot judge whether somebody is really good or really bad according to how much money they've got, or how long they got to live, or how many children or grandchildren they had. You got to find a better standard. If you want to judge, you got to find a better standard. That one doesn't work. And still, of course, in our own day and time, we have the rabbis struggling with it. You know, one of the best-selling books 25 years ago was called When Bad Things Happen to Good People. And Rabbi Kushner struggled with that all the way through his book. And what did he say at the end? I don't know. I don't know why sometimes really bad things happen to really good people. Sometimes it's just a matter of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. You just got to that intersection when a drunk driver got there, or a careless driver, or a texting driver, or whatever it was. You just got to that intersection at the wrong time. We certainly can point out in our own lives and our own families that sometimes we are paying the consequences of bad decisions. I mean, sometimes bad things happen to us because we made bad decisions. But sometimes we've done the best we know how, and bad things can still happen. So that's what Job is trying to say. Don't buy the old argument that everybody that lives a long time ends up with money and has a lot of kids and grandkids must have been a good person. It ain't necessarily so. And people who die young, have no children, grandchildren, are not necessarily bad people. Some really good poor people died young. Really good ones. Okay. So we'll start there next week. We've run out of time. We have handbells. We have choir. We have a lot of good things going on at 11. If you haven't been to church, don't rush off.